fresh lunch.
I'd like to introduce you to Cecilia. As you can see, she's really very beautiful, and she has wonderful texture hair. It's a little on the fine side, but the condition is really very, very nice. We've decided for her work, she needs it long enough so she can get a certain amount of flexibility if she wants to be able to braid it or wear it up. But I find that this length, it just splits a little bit too much on the shoulder. So we're going to come through a little shorter and a little squarer. It's a little long just in the front. So by coming through at about that length, we'll just get that little bit more softness and lift to the front. And I'm going to try and keep it as heavy as possible with very, very little graduation through. So we'll shampoo. I've taken my first section from the center of the eye to the center of the crown. The idea is that once I check the back together, both sides can be equal. Whereas if the parting starts off too low, you tend to get a very long section in the middle that doesn't quite work. So that my next section, my first section really for the cut, is from the crown to just behind the ear. I find it very important that you don't let this section come too far forward, because in that case you'd be cutting a part of the hair that really belongs across here. And if you cut that too far back, you're inclined to get a hole over the ear when the hair dries. Keep the model's head in as natural a position as possible, because this can, working with the pressure that we're going to be using, if the head is too far forward or too far back, it can definitely change your graduation. So work with the natural fall of the hair, find the direction that it's going to be most consistently in, and then experiment with your first shape. I try to avoid taking my first section too short, because you can never be quite sure what the hair is going to do. And of course I'm going to be coming around quite square, so this will probably be a nice length for the back. The front will be getting a little shorter. The thing to notice is that now that I've established a shape, that this direction here won't change, and my basic shape here won't change. And you can see I'm using very little pressure, which is going to give me the minimum amount of graduation. I say pressure because if I wanted more graduation, I would stretch the hair down further, and then by doing that, I'd be able to take that top section a little shorter, which, as the hair dries, would give me that little bit more bevel. So you can see that I'm just keeping it just enough there just for control. Of my comb, I find it a little bit more comfortable. I feel more balanced. But if you prefer, you can do exactly the same thing using your hand. The important part of it, of course, is to be consistent. can see as I'm checking there, there's very, very little graduation. It's just enough to keep it exactly even. I can tell I'm at the same length because you can feel the extra thickness on your scissors when you're catching that underneath layer. You'll notice that my sections are the same thickness, and my parting here is parallel to my shape here. Let's bring your head up a little bit, thanks. This will be the last section for the back. I like to leave the very top so that when I finish the whole thing I can just check it all together. Looking good. I think that's a nice length because as the hair dries it will lift just a little bit. So as I said before, I'll leave this and now I'll go into the side. I've taken my first section again from the center of the eye through to the crown. Cecilia's hair is quite fine, so I'm taking my first section fairly thick. I want to be able to get quite enough definition over the ear. This for most people is the most difficult section of the bob. You've got to be very careful placing the hair around the ear. So I'm putting just a little water on there just to give me a little bit more control. Now the important thing is that as I'm combing the hair, I'm not putting enough pressure on here to disturb the hair over the ear. Because this is the point where if you put too much pressure on there, you see that? The ear actually flexes, and that's what causes the hole as the hair dries. So what I'm doing is putting just enough pressure on there to control the hair, but not move the ear. Again, combing it in the same direction as I cut the back. And continuing my shape. I'll just comb that free, just to make sure I haven't trapped anything behind the ear. I'll put a little bit more water on the ends. And just check that down. See, as I'm combing the hair, I'm being very careful not to change this angle in order to put too much pressure on there. So I'm just checking, I'm just holding it in my comb just so that I can check it. That looks pretty good. Yeah. The most important thing throughout this entire section is that this angle here hasn't changed, the angle here hasn't changed, and the pressure hasn't changed. So by keeping those three things constant, the graduation will be nice and even. Because at any stage, if I were to increase that pressure or decrease that pressure, it will give me quite a considerable step. Section. I'm leaving out the triangle from the top here because I'll use that to overlap and join everything together later. Combing it down, I'm just checking out the underneath. So I'm just, as you can see, I'm just laying the hair very gently on the neck and just taking any stray pieces out from underneath. Of course, if this stage there were anything really wrong down there, I'd have to go back to that section and start from scratch. But at this point, I'm just joining the two sections together. That's looking good. I like the shape that that's building into. We're getting a nice volume and a very nice bevel on the end there. It's looking very good. So I'll just continue into the front section. It's very important here that you don't over-direct this front. You must remember that we are cutting it to be primarily square and fit into the side. So you must avoid coming out too far forward because you'll lose your shape. So I bring that across and pick up my previous shape and just continue. Changing my angle at all on the join, and the direction of this hasn't changed either, so the blend and the graduation should be very, very good. Of course, the advantage of coming just that little bit shorter in the front is that when we comb the hair back, it will release the wave a little bit and give us a little bit more volume. As well that it's my third section, and I've only just picked up this very front section here, because had that been cut into my first section, the chances would be that it would be that little too short. So you have to watch the growth pattern of the hair and bear in mind the weight and shape that you're cutting to. So now I'll take my last section, and now I'm picking up the crown section from before, taking the whole thing down. To follow exactly the same angles as before. I'm just checking that top section. Leaving that top section is really like a little safety valve. It just allows you to check the whole thing together that little bit more comfortably. So there we are, we're halfway through. So now I'll start on the other side. I've cut that side, and as you can see, all I've got to do now is just cross-check my top sections. This was from the previous section here that I left out as a join, and it looks just a little bit heavy to me. So I just cross-check, nowhere near as heavily as that it may sound. So again, just check my join by the ear. I'd like to introduce you to Diane. We cut and permed the hair about 3 months ago, and the perm has softened down really very nicely. It looks very, very natural. I have cut this side already. I wanted to show you the basic difference of what I wanted to achieve. I've taken about 1.25 inches off, increased the graduation just slightly, almost followed through like a graduated bob, and that's just given me a very nice, interesting change of line. I think it's a little nicer for Diane, it's a little bit more complimentary, and it's a little bit softer. So now I think I'd like to cut into this side. I've taken my first parting from the distribution point to just behind the ear, and my line is going to be coming through slightly longer in the center, getting slightly shorter towards the front. So that in itself will create a little bit of graduation for me. So my partings are going to be correspondingly so, right the way through this section. So I already have my guideline from the other side, so I take that as a central point. And follow that through. You can see that I'm using very little pressure. Diane's hair, fortunately, is not too thick, and there is enough curl in the perm to give me a nice softness in there, so I won't have to overwork that too much. You can see that's lifting quite nicely. So I'll take my next section. At this point, I don't even need any graduation in there. It's lifting up quite nicely. So you can see I'm not changing my angles too much. I'm keeping a very steady pressure on here, so that when the perm lifts, I'll get all the graduation I need. It's just starting to get a little heavy in the center. This is from my V shape. So I'll just pick out that centerpiece. It's just enough to round out that center section. Again, I'll take that piece out. Starting to put a very small amount of graduation in here. You'll notice that I'm taking relatively narrow sections. I don't want to cut too heavy a clean straight line. So rather than checking the whole section together, I'm taking it in small pieces. That will just give me a softer, more natural finish. my guideline from the other side, so at this point I'm just checking the two shapes together. Being careful not to round the shape out too much, because then I would lose too much length. So you can see this section is just a little heavy in the center, so again I pick that out. See that this section is just starting to get a little bit too much weight, even with the first amount of graduation. So I picked that section up again and just extended it a bit further. You'll see that if I hold it in my previous section, I've got quite a nice definition line there. So I just increase that graduation just enough to soften it that little bit further. The nice thing about Diane's perm is that I can approach it just as I would a naturally curly head of hair, because the curl is quite uniform. So I can work totally to the texture. See, although I only took a little bit off, that loosens that up quite nicely. At this point, the top layer will hardly reach my first shape, so I pick that up. And as I said before, you can see the definition, so there's no guesswork involved. You just cut to that directly. See, the shape is sitting very nicely together, and just by increasing the shape in here, I'm keeping the length, but I'm getting a little bit more lift and softness into that. It's important to note that my shapes throughout here don't change, even as at this point when I'm joining my two shapes together. I try and keep this consistent. I'm not over-directing too much, and I'm not applying too much pressure. So the combined effect of the continuity here and the relatively narrow section as I'm cutting give me a nice, loose, soft effect. You want to avoid cutting any hard, straight lines. Graduation at this point, because I will be checking all of this forwards, which will help to round out that shape a little bit. But I like the line that we're getting to, and I think the length is just right too. So now I can continue into the side. I've taken my next parting, as usual, from the distribution point to, in this case, just below the center of the eye, because I am anticipating a side parting with a lot of emphasis through the front here. So I really want to check this into the back first, and then the next section of the cut will be to check this forward to create the softness. So thinking in terms of that, I like the length and detail here, so I'm just going to follow through in a very simple shape. So my first section is there, and again, being very careful not to put too much pressure, not to stretch the hair too much over the ear. I just extend my line. You'll notice that I'm not working with the hair too wet. I really like to be able to see the reaction and judge the amount of curl. I think with curly hair, if you work with it too damp, it tends to look too straight, and you tend to get more reaction than you anticipated. So you can see I hardly need to graduate that at all, so I'll take my next section. as with the bob, be very careful that you're not disturbing the hair here too much. Just very gently hold it down. So I'm just starting to get a little bit more weight in here than I need, so I just take out the hairline, keep that for softness, and continue with the graduation that I established at the back. I'm using this as my guideline, so there is very, very little to come off. It's important to notice as at the back that my angles here do not change at all. It just takes a little bit of discipline and a little bit of practice to keep your angles exactly the same. Then I take out my previous section. I just cut across into the section enough just so that I can check into and match into that previous section. See, I have got a defined line there from my previous section. So I'll match to that, and then I check it just to see. It's still a little heavy, so I'll pick that section up again and just increase that a little bit. You see, I'll stretch it that little bit further. So that's not only giving me that little bit more graduation, but it's giving me a softer texture at the same time. This is the last section. Now I'm building up a little bit more weight in here than I need, but at the moment I'm concentrating purely on the blend through here. So I continue there. There is in fact very little to come off this section. I like the length and I like the shape that we're getting through here very much. I particularly like the softness here, but we're not getting quite enough volume or roundness in this section here. It's looking a little flat. So the easiest and safest way to do that is leave this hairline out and then start cross-checking this section and bring the whole section forward. So by doing that, I can protect the length that I have here, but I can take out this unnecessary weight. So again, you can see I have a very good guideline there. I just avoid taking that underneath section too short. So it'll just give me that little bit more softness. I'll just check that again. Exactly the same principle as before. I try to maintain this angle here, and by cutting the same shape in here, just lifting a little bit to increase my graduation. That way I have no fear of taking this too short, but I'm gradually increasing the graduation just in here. So what that's doing is nicely rounding out that shape, giving me a much better proportion and much more softness without going any shorter. So now I can work into the rest of the section. So you can see from the length that I'm already working with, this really is very nice, because this will blend in here very nicely. What I have to do is get rid of some of this weight. So my first line came through here, my second line was here, my third line would obviously come down. Now if I needed to increase this, say, volume and take this shorter, I would simply follow that line through. But I like the length, I just want to lose the weight, so my next shape will come down this way. So you can see I've taken my first section parallel to my design line. I have a good line here, so I don't want to take that any shorter, so I just pick up the last of my previous section, which is this piece just in here, and this is the length I want to keep. So I just check the two together. As you can see with my partings, I'm being very careful not to take that whole hairline in one section. I'm splitting it into three. The main idea is to protect the length and also protect the softness. Because if your line here is too parallel to the hairline, there is a tendency to get a little short in the center. So I pick up my previous section. As you can see, I'm doing everything I can to protect this length here. So my previous shape finished just in here, you can just see it. So I'm joining those two angles together. The direction here has not changed from the side. I'm following that through completely. So by taking this corner out here, what I'm actually doing is taking out the length and weight that I was developing in here. So at this point I'm actually checking all of my three sections together. You can see I'm coming across the top of all of them. I'm checking into the back, the previous side and the front. So that's just to give me a little more continuity and also round out my top layer. And of course by drawing it forward I needn't worry about cutting the back too short, because in actual fact you can see it's hardly reaching the section. Just gives me that better finish and a little more continuity. Takes out any possible corners. So now I'll be cutting into my last section. As you remember, I left this previously because I wasn't sure just how much my graduation was going to crease in the front. So I draw the whole thing forward. Again, the angle here doesn't change, and of course my angles here don't change. It just gives me an opportunity to blend the three shapes together, because I have a nice defined shape here. So by drawing it forward, I'm protecting the length of the back. I'm just taking out any squareness or heaviness. I like very much the shape that I'm getting. I like the softness and I like the volume. And of course I did cut it primarily for a side effect. But what I'm going to do now is just cross-check so that Diane is not restricted totally to a parting or any one form, because I think I'd like the whole thing to have that little bit more movement and softness. So what I'm going to do now is just cross-check the front section. As you can see, I'm being very careful not to cut into this section at all. I like the softness and I like the length. So what I'm doing is checking the two shapes forward, joining the two lines together. You can see that I've got quite an accumulation in the center there. So this line is good from my side, and this line is good from my other side. So I'm just joining the two together. That will give me that little bit more volume and loosen up the texture very nicely in the center. So in all intents and purposes, I'm just cross-checking the tops together. So as you can see, I'm really checking this all the way forward, so there's very, very little to come off. So what I'll do now is, obviously the hair is getting very dry. I've been combing it quite a while, so I'll damp it down and just let the curl come back, and then spend a few seconds just checking the weight and seeing if I've left anything too heavy. Diane's hair is drying in. The texture is very nice. There's a few pieces that are just a fraction straight. It might be just where I caught the perm on at awkward length. So I'm just going to point out a few pieces just to improve the texture. Because rather than disturb the whole graduation, I find it much easier just to, like this little piece here is just too heavy, so I can just looking really good. I think we'll just let Diane dry for a few minutes and see how it works out. Okay. Smile. You're on Candy Camera. I'd like to introduce you to Madeleine. As you can see, she has a very, very nice, fine hair. You know I've got a preference for fine hair. There is a lot of perm, as you can see. And what we've decided to do, what we would like to do, is cut it short enough to take the perm out. Because we found that at this length, there really isn't enough in the root area where she really needs it to get some help and reaction. And we're also very, very tight at this length. So I have started on the other side, just to give you a basic idea of what I've got in mind. I want a very classic, very tight shape. So I followed through on a very simple line. Slightly geometric. I'm looking to keep a lot of softness through here. I've left some weight in here because until I've cut the other side, of course, I don't know exactly how short I'm going to cut this. And I've left some weight through the top here because I want to get an asymmetric front. I like very much the line that is created with this movement in here. So I'll be cutting through here quite dramatically and taking the back shorter. But I think this is a good point to start. I've taken my first section, as always, from the distribution point to just behind the ear, and I do have my length already determined by the other side. So I'm very, very fortunate that Madeleine has such a nice hairline. It grows extremely nicely. So at least I don't have to concern myself with fighting that too much. So my angle is going to be quite extreme, so I've taken my first parting to match that, and as I say, I do have my length already well established here. So I take my first section. I'm trying to avoid any clean lines on the neck here, so I'm going to cut it relatively short, but I'm going to protect the softness by just drawing it between my hands and taking a little bit forward. I can just check to see how that behaves. I think I'll take it just a fraction shorter. So to do that, I'm just increasing that angle a little bit. Should work very nicely. quite short enough, so I'll pick that up again and increase that angle. That's much better. As I take that weight out of there, the hem moves much nicer. So you can see that as I'm picking up my next section, I'm following that angle quite extremely because I don't want to build up too much weight. If I change the line too much at this point, the top layers will get far too heavy. Because although the angle is quite extreme, as I've kept the underneath quite soft, to watch at this point is remember the position of the ear and the direction that I'm combing it in, because I can't afford to extend this too far, otherwise it will get too short behind the ear. So I'm working to about that point that I am now, and that angle shouldn't increase any at all. At this point I'm just cross-checking my two lines together. That looks nice. See that at this point I'm being very careful not to get too short in this section just here, because I want to keep this weight line so that I can get a more dramatic front. So of course I am getting a little bit more weight than I possibly need there, but when I've done the top I can cross-check that through, so I'm not worrying about that too much at this point. I like what's happening here very much. balance is building up very nicely. You can see what I mean by triangular shape here. I want to round out afterwards, so I think that's as far as I'll go at this point. I'll wait to see how heavy the sides become first. I've taken my next section just a little lower than usual. My idea is that I want to keep as much weight here as possible for the very front. And at this point I'm more interested in just in a very nice blend here. So I have my guideline here to work to. So I won't cut the first section too short. I just take a look and see exactly what happens. So I followed the basic line, but as you can see, quite a bit longer than I expect to cut it. Missed a little bit there. It just gives me the opportunity to see exactly how the hairline is going to behave and which way the hair is falling. But that looks very nice, so I'll take it a good bit shorter. The basic principles of the haircut haven't changed at all, because although I'm holding it in my hand to keep it softer, you'll notice that the general direction here is not changing too much. And once I have established an angle, as in this case here, I pretty much keep to it. A little heavy there, so I'm going to have to increase that graduation just a bit. I like the softness of what is happening underneath, but I'd held that section a little too low, so I'm just increasing my graduation in that just a point. Taken my first section for the front, and I want to be very careful to protect the softness underneath here. So I'm picking up my previous guideline and just extending that. Maintaining the angle because I want to keep as much length in front as possible. So I'll just, in fact, they're a little long as well, so I'll just take that a little shorter and shaft my angle just a fraction. far forward. I don't want to spoil my line or my shape. I'm picking up a bit more weight than I really need here, but I intend to cross-check that entire section, so I'm not worrying about that at this point. I'm just checking this.